Hello everyone, welcome to day 7. We have a lot of code to do today, so no real overview other than this. Just saying, hey, we're going to be coding and we're going to be doing a Q&A. So let's go ahead and jump right into the code. Okay, so the first thing is obviously opening up our VS Code project. And I will say, for those of you who are not aware of this, on my GitHub page, let me just write this down here. My GitHub page, I'll just put it on the screen, and I'll do https://cfe.sh/github. If you look for Bootcamp 1, there is actually where all of the reference code will be if you ever get stuck with something. So definitely go there for all that. Now, we want to talk about doing orders and inventory. Now, I will say, if you start to actually have more advanced shopping requirements, as in you want to have a bunch of products, you want to have a shopping cart, that starts to add a huge layer of complexity that you wouldn't necessarily do it in the approach that I am. In the sense that on our product model, what we're going to do now is we're actually going to add an inventory item here, which is actually going to reflect the price itself. So it's going to be an integer field. Now, again, this is a very simple version of doing inventory. Realistically, if you had a lot of projects with, a lot of products with a lot of variance in the product itself, like size of a t-shirt, for example, you're going to probably want to have inventory in a completely different model and perhaps even a completely different application itself. But in my case, I'm just going to do a very simple inventory field like this, which also means that I'm also going to say a method in here that's called has inventory. And this method is really meant to just check if self.inventory is greater than 0. And that's actually the condition that I want to return. So that's it, right? So this will give me a true or false value. And we'll see using this in just a little bit. The next thing is I want to change the integer field from the price to a decimal field. And this is because I actually want the default price of a product to be with a decimal field, right? So in US dollars, any given price, let's say it's $9.99, right? So $9.99. We need a decimal field to use that. So I'm also going to go ahead and add in some of the required arguments to this, which one is max digits. So the maximum amount of digits we want to allow in this item. And then we also want to have decimal places. So the maximum amount of decimal places that we want to have. So in my case, it's just 2, right? So these trailing 2. In max digits, I believe it accounts for all of these things. But honestly, if you are too concerned about max digits, just put like 20 in there. It's not a huge deal. It's actually a lot more important when you use other kinds of numbers than price, right? So if somebody's selling a 20-digit priced item, well, that's a really expensive item, and I don't think you're going to be buying it in this fashion at all. Anyway, so let's go. I'm going to leave it in as 10 digits. That's definitely an expensive item too, but we'll leave that. Okay, so we made a bunch of changes to our models. Now, what do we do when we make changes to our models? Well, it's really simple. Python manage.py, make migrations, just like we did when we first made that model. And as we see here, Django automatically is saying, hey, database, get prepared to change. And all of those changes are listed in this file, which you can look at by hitting Command click or Control click as it mentions. So it added that field of inventory on the product model, and then it altered the field of price to being a decimal field, right? And the default is just $0. So you're going to want to change those things inside of the admin itself. So that's it. That's the actual now product model, which is good because we want to actually use this in our order calculation. So the next thing is actually jumping into our order models. So going into orders, we're going to come in here, and now we're going to be doing all sorts of foreign key associations. So the first one is I want to grab the user model itself. So from django.contrib.auth, we're going to import the get user model. And then I'm going to go ahead and declare the user model here. So get user model. And then I'm also going to import the order, or rather the product model itself. So products.models import product. Now, this actually doesn't have to happen, right? So you don't have to assign the product to the order itself, but I actually want to do that. So in here, I'm going to go ahead and say class order, and this is models.model. And at the default, I'm going to say that there's a user and there's a product, right? So again, if you were having multiple products, this is not necessarily the method you'd use. Like you wouldn't associate the user on here, or excuse me, you would associate the user, but you wouldn't associate just one product. You would have many different products. So as you might be able to tell in just a moment, the complexity can get pretty complex pretty quickly. So anyway, so let's go ahead and add this user in here. So we'll do models.foreign key, and that's the user. We'll also allow it to be null. And then on delete, like we always do, let me just break this part down. On delete, we will go ahead and say equals to models.set null. Now, the big reason for me that I want a set null on delete is because if the user is deleted from my system for some reason, the order record is not. Next one will be models.foreign key, and this is going to be product, null being true, and on delete equals to models.set null as well. Same thing as applies to that. If the product's deleted, I do want record of the order still, even if that product is deleted. So the other thing is you actually might come in here and say product, SKU or something along those lines, where you actually store the product SKU that's associated to this order as well. But I'm actually not going to do that. That would just be another way to ensure that if you accidentally deleted one of the products, you still had the record of the SKU in the product itself. Because how foreign keys work is this is just a reference to a line in another table, right? So if that line is deleted, then this will be empty, right? It won't actually have something in there. And thus having another field that would reference that might be a good idea in the long run. But, we don't have to get too complicated here. Okay, so now what we want in our order is a few things. So I'm actually going to copy this price decimal field thing here just to make it simple on myself. And we got price. This time it's going to actually be, let's call it subtotal. Okay, next one is going to be the tax. And then the next one is total. Okay, so naturally you could put shipping, like that's shipping price in here as well. And you could use the same method that I'm doing here to apply that to shipping as well. I'm just not going to do that. It's going to add another step that's a little redundant to what we'll end up doing with tax. So essentially what I'll be doing here is I'll be taking the product price. That will be the subtotal initially. And then I will multiply that product price by some sort of tax rate, thus getting the tax amount, and then adding the subtotal and the tax to get the total amount. So that's what we'll end up doing here. Next thing is we'll go ahead and add a paid value. So as in, how much did this user actually pay for this item, right? No surprise there. Next, I'm actually just going to put the shipping address right on this order as well as a text field here. So blank equal to true and null equaling to true. Okay, so right off the bat, you're going to be like, well, shouldn't this be its own model itself? And the answer is probably. You'd probably want to have this as its own model, where it is another foreign key item into the order itself. Now, honestly, doing that adds another layer of complexity that we just don't want to spend a lot of time doing here, right? It's kind of takes away from actually getting to the goal what we have, which is just purchasing one product. And really just having a shipping address. If the user enters their shipping address wrong here, then it will give us an opportunity to reach out to that user and be like, hey, what's your shipping address? We notice that it's an incorrect one, those sorts of things. And along those same lines, we can absolutely use the same concept for a billing address. Okay. And then finally, what I want to do is actually have a timestamp. And we're going to go ahead and do models.datetime field. And this is going to be auto now add equaling to true. Now, if you're not aware of what date timestamps are, or timestamps there are for a datetime field, is essentially whenever you create this model, this will automatically add a date time object when you actually create the model itself. So this happens on its own with this auto now add equals to true. There are other variants of this that you can do, but the nice thing about this is that also allows us to kind of declare what our order status might be. So let's actually do that. So I'm going to go ahead and say order status choices. And this is mainly for internal use, right? So the first choice would probably be like whether or not it was created. This, of course, is probably the default, right? So when you create an order, it should be considered as created. And guys, I'm actually having a little bit of an audio interruption here. Sorry about that. We're going to actually have to pause for a few minutes because it is trash day. Sometimes they come at this time, sometimes they don't. So let's pause and we'll be back in maybe like 3 or 4 minutes, but I will be on the live chat answering questions to keep you guys as informed as possible as to when all of that noise is going to stop. So thank you for bearing with me. We'll pick up right where we left off. And we're back. Thanks for hanging out for just a moment there, guys. Unpredictable when the garbage collector comes. It might be at 1 p.m. or it might be now, which is 10:15 a.m. Of course, that happens while we're live. But anyways, let's get back to it. All right. So what I'm trying to do here is have several different ways of denoting where the order is and what status it's in, and one of them is going to be stale. Right, so like after some time, we actually want to mark orders as stale, like they're no longer really in order because they actually never finished it. So the next one being paid. Now you're probably wondering, what is this tuple? Like, why am I using tuples here, or tuples of tuples, or tuples of tuples, however you want to pronounce it? The reason for this is this actually gives me a new kind of field inside of my model that I can use for selecting those choices. So I'm going to go ahead and right underneath the product itself, I'll go ahead and add a status here, and this is models.char field, and the max length being 20. And now I can go ahead and say choices equals to some of these choices in here. And then my default is going to actually be created. Okay, so that's always going to be the initial one. So I don't necessarily have to set whether or not it's created. So these are a few different choices here. Now, a couple other ones that you might also want to have is shipped, like assuming, if it's paid, then yeah, the next step would be shipped, obviously. And then finally, something like refunded. That is yet another one that you might end up having in here. Now, I will say that these are another candidate to be outside of the order model itself, like status events, right? So when it's created, then it's created, and you have a whole nother model that denotes that this order was created with a foreign key. But again, that's starting to add a layer of complexity that we just don't need to illustrate all of this, what we're trying to accomplish here. So anyway, so now that we've got this order model, let's go ahead and make sure that it's inside of our installed applications for the orders app, and of course it's not here, so we'll go ahead and say orders here. And now I'm going to go ahead and again run make migrations. Now I actually never ran migrate, so now that I have these two things, I'll go ahead and run python manage.py migrate. Okay, so I get a invalid item here on the database, so this might be related to my own personal tests. So when in doubt, something like that, I'm like, hey, I don't know why the database is failing, so I'm just going to delete my old database. All right, so always, I do that all the time when I'm running local tests, right? So there we go. So the database is now deleted, and I want to create another super user in my case, and CFE. Doesn't matter what the password is. Okay, cool. So there we go. So now we've got our order model and our product model updated a bit. So let's go ahead and run the server here. And I will also say, actually, one thing with our product model that I should have actually put on here was featured, right? So a Boolean field for featured. So we'll go ahead and say featured equals to models.Boolean field, and default being false. Okay, so is this the featured product? Because again, we're going off of one product. We're not having a bunch of products. We're not doing search. We're not doing a shopping cart. We're not doing all of those really cool things, unfortunately. But let's go ahead and actually now add this field in here. So we'll go ahead and make migrations, and then we'll migrate, and I'll run the server now. And let's go ahead and jump into the admin again. And I'll log in here, and we'll go into our product. I'll create a product here. I'm going to add it to the owner. The person who's creating this is the only user I have, and I'll just call this product 1. Really, really cool name for a product, don't you think? So 29, let's say 99. And the inventory items, I'm going to give it 100. And I will say this is a featured product. Okay, so now that we've got that, what I want to do is illustrate how to create our order, right? So when it comes to the order itself, we had this created status code, which means that when the person says, I want to order this, it's going to be a completely different page, and it will actually create this order model for us. So let's go ahead and actually create that page. I'm going to go ahead and import from models. We're going to import the order. And then from products.models, we're going to go ahead and import the product itself. So define, and this is going to be like our order checkout or order finalize view. Let's just call it order checkout view. And it's going to take in a request. And then, of course, it's going to return render. And in this case, we're going to go ahead and return the request. I also actually want to just return forms.html, which we'll talk about in a second. But we'll leave it empty here. And the first things first is I'm going to go ahead and give it the order itself that we want to use. And this is going to be, let's use QS equals to product.objects.filter. And there's going to be featured equals to true. Because again, that Boolean field ideally only has one featured model. And even if it doesn't, that's okay, because we'll just then go ahead and say, if not qs.exists, then we'll return a redirect maybe to the home page. Okay, so let's go ahead and import redirect here. Now what I'll do is I'll say product equals to qs.first. Okay, really simple. So now I actually have the product itself. And I probably want to have the login required here. So the login required decorator. And you know what? It's eluding me on how to actually import it. So what is the Django login required decorator? Right? Do this all the time. Okay, so here it is. There is the Django login required decorator. Now the reason I want the login required decorator is because on this checkout, what I want to have happen is I want to make sure that this is actually a user, so I can feel confident that I can say user equals to request.user. Okay, so the reason that I can feel confident about that is, of course, this login required decorator, but also if I didn't have that, it would be an anonymous user. And we definitely do not want to use an anonymous user when we are trying to use this foreign key here. Right, so I actually want to create this order here. All right, so now what I'll do is go ahead and just say order.objects.create and product equals to product and user equals to user. Okay, really simple and not a whole lot to this, right? So let's go ahead and actually add this into our URLs and just bring it in here. Order checkout view. And I'm actually going to put it right next to this path itself. So we'll go ahead and say path. And let's just call it checkout. And then the order checkout view in here. All right. Simple enough. So let's go ahead and make sure our server is running. Oops, haha. I did the wrong import from the order checkout. Silly mistake there. So from orders.views, import the order checkout view. And we save that. And now we're back. So now if I go to the URL of checkout, just like that, I hit enter. You know, it says send data. The reason is because we're rendering out form.html. We don't have form data yet, but we are actually creating order objects. So let's go back into the admin itself. And from .models, we're going to import order and then admin.site.register that order model so we can actually see it in our order itself. So let's go back into the admin. I'm going to go ahead and copy this, paste in here, go into the admin, and here we go. So here it is. We have 3 order objects in here. No surprise, they all say created, right? And also no surprise that they exist. Now this is one of those cases where I'm using a GET request and it's actually creating the order for me. Right, so this is actually the method that I'm thinking about doing this, in the sense that if they're going to the checkout page, I want to make reference that they went to that checkout page, right? And that's pretty much it. I want to make sure that I'm using whatever that reference is. But I don't necessarily want to do it literally every time they go there, right? So I'm doing it literally every time they go there, which is, you know, it's fine, but that's actually not what I want to do. Instead, what I want to do is I'm going to go ahead and say order obj equals to that. But what I also want to say is order obj ID equals to request.session.get, and let's go ahead and say order obj ID, or as in order object ID, which we can just keep it simple and call it order ID. Okay, so if this is none, then we'll go ahead and create that. So we'll go ahead and say if order ID equals to none, then we'll go ahead and create it, and now say request.session and order ID equals to that recently created order object, so .id. Okay, so what I want to do now is actually delete all of these order objects here and say okay. Oh, and one other thing is, since this is an order object ID, the next part of this is I'm going to go ahead and actually try and get the order object itself. So first off, we'll say order object equals to none. And then I'll go ahead and do try and say order object equals to order.objects.get ID equals to that order ID. Again, we've got the ID here. So whatever the session variable of that ID should actually get this object. If not, we're going to just do a catch-all exception and say the order ID is equal to none, which means that this will absolutely create another order object for me. Okay, so let me just break down as to why we're doing it this method versus pretty much any other method, right? So first and foremost, we want to make sure that we're tracking when our users are going to check out on this product. Whatever the product is, we want to make sure that we are checking that out. And to do that, we can assign it to our requested session. Now, if you were using more advanced methods here, you wouldn't use the order ID, but instead you would have something like a cart variable that's very similar to how this would function, but it would be for all sorts of products. So instead of it being the order, it would just be the cart itself. And then the cart itself would then turn into an order once you go to finalize it. But now what I'm going to be getting is every time this user has a session, then I'll know whether or not they're working on this order. Because the other thing is, we don't want to create an order literally every time they go to the checkout, because if they go back to the homepage and like, oh, I'm going to do a little bit more research, and then they go back to checkout, then it's like, okay, now I'm ready to buy it. We don't need new order objects for every single time you do that. So now we actually do have a new one because our session didn't have it. But if I refresh in here several times, ideally we don't actually see our order incrementing at all. But what we can do is actually print out what the order ID is, regardless of where we're at in that session. So print order object or order obj.id. And let's go back into checkout. We'll refresh that several times. And there we go. So we actually now have the same actual ID here. And how do you actually end the session itself? Well, a really easy way to do it is logging out, right? So logging out will create a brand new session and therefore an order object. So there is a way to automatically expire your session as well, something I'm not going to cover right now. But this is pretty cool. So now we actually have a single order for this actual session, right? So one single order for it, assuming they went to that page to go on and finalize the next steps. So now what we need to do is actually turn this into a form itself. So the finalizing of this order, how do we actually do that? Well, this is going to be, of course, inside of a form. So inside of orders here, we're going to go ahead and do forms.py, and we'll run from Django import forms, and then from models, we're going to go ahead and import the order model. And in this case, I'm going to go ahead and say class order form, and it's going to be forms.model form. Now, naturally, we've already learned about these things. So what we can do here, the actual simplest things that we need from this order form are really just our additional data from this particular user, which is related to the order, which is simply fields of the shipping address and the billing address. Right, so at this point, that's all we really need in our order form because we don't have a way to collect payment. However, this would essentially solve that for us too. So eventually, maybe we'd have some sort of billing information in there as well. And you might be wondering, well, how come all these other things aren't in here? Like, why isn't subtotal in here? Why isn't tax in here and all that? We'll get there in just a second. But the things that we notice here is user, right? So we're already assigned the user there. We've already assigned a product to that order as well. And then we have our status items in here, right? So the status items are related to my own management of this, right? So it's an internal thing. It's not really a user themselves would not be declaring these things. So of course we don't need to set that. So all of these financial things we don't need to set. So really the only user input is the shipping and billing addresses. Okay, cool. So the next thing actually we do want to address, and that is the product itself, right? So if for some reason the product is not equal to the saved product, then we're probably going to have to create a brand new one, right? So what we want to say then is order object.product.id is not equal to product.id. Then we just create that brand new one and add it also to the session. Okay. So yet again, this is slightly different than this call right here. So this also assumes that we do have an order object, right? So this is saying this is no order ID and also probably no order object itself either. But I'm going to leave out that part because for sure if we don't have an order ID, then we definitely are going to be creating an order object itself. So in here, one more condition I'm just going to put, if the order obj is not equal to none, then we're going to go ahead and run this conditional statement. Now, of course, if I just created it, I probably don't need that. So new creation equals to false. And then we'll just come in here and say this is a new creation. And now we'll go ahead and say and new creation equals to false. That way we're not hammering our database too much for redundant things, right? So if I'm creating a new order, then yeah, I don't actually need to recreate that order. But since we've got that, I can actually just bring in my request session down here if I was so inclined, right? Because if I actually have the order ID, I can just keep that as my request session, so I don't need to do it over and over again, right? Ideally, reducing redundancies as much as possible. Okay, so this now brings us back to the form itself. So what do we do with the form, right? How do we actually bring the form in this whole mess that's going on here? So to do this, well, we are going to come back into forms.py. And naturally, I can import this form. But one of the things that I want to do is call the clean method. So earlier, Sagar was the first one to mention this. But when we actually did the forms, you can use the clean method to clean the entire form itself. So we would say something like this: clean data equals to super.clean. And you know, whenever in doubt, just add these args and keyword args. So this clean data is for the entire form itself, and we'll just return whatever that clean data is. So inside of here, what I actually want to have is I want to check product inventory on the form's submission. So basically, I want to make sure that when they are clicking to order, I want to make sure that there's actually inventory left. If there's not inventory left, I need to raise a validation error. So how do I actually assign the product to this order form? Now you're like, okay, well, don't you already have a product field in here? Well, you do, but the form itself may or may not actually have the order instance on there for several reasons. So I'm going to show you one of the ways to actually assign a product object or any kind of object to the form itself without getting hopefully too complex. So what we need to do here is actually override the init method here. And this is going to take in self and args and keyword args. And naturally, we want to have the default still happen. So the init method is a initializer method. This is called on every single class that Python has, right? So this right here is always going to be called. The reason I'm calling super is because I'm inheriting from another class, and I'm not positive what's happening in that init method itself. So we definitely call super here for that. So in these keyword arguments, I can actually pass my own keyword argument in there and call it product equals to keyword arguments and pop the actual product itself, or we'll say none, and then we'll self-set.product equals to that product. Okay, so this is definitely new for a lot of you if you've never done this in a model form before. So going back into my view then, let's go ahead and import this form, and we'll do from.forms. We're going to import the order form here. So now when I actually initialize the form, so I'll go ahead and say form equals to that initialize the form, I can actually pass in the product that I have itself. So the actual product object, which is up there. So now this form actually has access to that product object itself, right? So it may or may not have an instance. It may or may not have this object in here. That is another way to do it, but I wanted to show you this way because perhaps this is outside the realm of what you're actually trying to accomplish yourself. But anyway, so now we've got the ability to have this product form in here, and we can say if form.is valid, then we're going to go ahead and print out the form.cleanedData.get shipping address and also the billing address. Okay, billing address. Okay, cool. And in the context itself, I'm going to go ahead and add that form in. So form and form. All right. So now what I want to do is actually just come into my form, and I'm just going to, in my clean data here, I'm just going to go ahead and say if not self.product. Okay, so self.product is this right here. So it may be none. If it's not equal to none, and if self.product has inventory, then we're good. So really this is again, if not this should be if self.product is not equal to none, and this should be if it does not have inventory. Then we'll go ahead and say raise forms.validation error, and this product is out of inventory. Okay. So actually this method itself, we just need to verify that inside of our product object, we have that instance method. In this case, it does have inventory. So I'm going to go ahead and comment this out for a moment and just return false here to test out this validation on its own without actually adjusting the inventory altogether. And yes, you would probably want to use unit tests here as well. So we save this, and now we refresh in our checkout. Now I have my shipping address and my billing address. If I hit send data, it looks like seems like it's actually working. Part of the reason for that is this form right here. So I do want to still send in the request.post or none, as well as that product itself. So I do want to still handle the post data. So let's refresh in here, or actually reload the page, and I'll hit send data. And this is now saying product is out of inventory. Okay, really, really simple way on handling all of that. So one of the things actually to note here is I'm actually not using order form as a model form. I'm really just using it as a form to clean and verify that we do have product data. So I will mention that before we did something related to passwords, and I said, hey, how do you actually verify that the passwords are equivalent? This is one of those ways, is you can actually call that clean data and call the validation error whether or not there's actually a correct password. In this case, we just passed a product, but this is actually bringing a product over there, right? So let's say, for instance, I actually didn't have any of this stuff here. And this is actually where the value of being able to pass in that product in there in general is if I didn't have all of those things, this is actually where I can now initialize that product with that order and still have that validation. Thus, a lot more resilient to other code changes that you might have, right? So you might be like, oh, I don't actually need my product in the session. I don't care about that at all. And if you don't care about having it in the session itself, then this would be the method you would go about doing things, and then you would absolutely still be able to validate that product, which is why I showed you that. I mean, otherwise we would just use the session itself and not necessarily use a model form. So I'm gonna really leave that up to you, but it's important to see that you can absolutely diverge on how all of this can be done, which adds to a layer of complexity that it's like, oh well, what's the best way to do it? Well, it really depends on the product scope itself. Okay, so not quite done yet though, because what we want to do is actually associate the shipping address and billing address to this order. So order object dot shipping address equals to this form.cleanData.get. Okay, so that's one way to do it. Another way is to actually pass in the instance itself to this order object. This is actually probably the preferred way because we do have an order object. We are creating it. This, of course, takes advantage of using a model form and also shows you how to update and change things. So let's actually take a look at that. So I am still explicitly writing the fields that I want here. So order obj and billing address. The reason being is I actually don't necessarily need to change all of the fields in this order object. So then we'll just do order obj.save. Okay, cool. So again, we've got our instance actually coming through in this order form. So let's take a look at this. Before I actually run anything in this order form itself, I'm actually going to go into the order object, the most recent one, which I think is just 7. I think that's our current active one. And I'll just go ahead and say ABC on my shipping address and hit save. And now if I refresh in here, I see that my ABC address is in here. So this is actually how you update fields as well. It's coming back in here. It's right here. So without the product, you don't actually need the product in there to update an instance. So I can actually get rid of that altogether. And this will still allow me to update that order instance itself, including whatever I store into it, right? So anything that I store into that order form or that order model form actually has access to it, which is really cool. So that's definitely another option that you may want to use at some point in the future. But certainly in this product order form, because before they check out, I want to make sure that I'm getting the correct data altogether, right? So I want to make sure that their shipping address is correct, their billing address is correct, and if they navigate away, I'm still keeping that session, and they would actually be able to come back and update that data as you would. Okay, so cool. So now that we've got this, what I want to do is introduce a new concept that we haven't talked much about, and this is a concept of signals. Signals is whenever you actually create something. So right here we're creating something, right here we're creating something. Our Django project can actually send a signal to handle some other types of creation that we might want to do. So inside of our model itself, what I actually want to do is when it's created, I automatically want to calculate these totals, right? So whatever those totals are, I definitely want to calculate them. So let's actually create a method for that. So I'm going to call this define and calculate. And this is going to be self and save equals to false. I'll explain the save part in a moment. So we want to actually calculate every single piece of this. Now the first thing is the product itself may be null. So if I've got a null product, then I'll go ahead and say if not self.product, then we're going to return just an empty dictionary here. But if I actually have a product, then we'll go ahead and say the subtotal is really just equal to that product price. So self.product.price. And then I'm going to give a arbitrary tax rate. Of course, this can also get a lot more complex. You'd have another model itself and actually look up their various tax rates. But I'm just going to use 12%. Very arbitrary. So I'll go ahead and say the tax total is equal to the subtotal times that tax rate. Okay. So unfortunately, what's going to happen with the decimal fields built in to Django is the rounding is going to be an error. So this is not going to be always 100% perfect because multiplying two numbers that have decimal places might actually affect how you work with everything. So there's a couple of ways on how to solve this, and you're just going to have to take my word for it at this point, but you can do it in your own tests. But a couple of ways on how to solve this is actually, instead of using a decimal field, use an integer field and just multiply all of these numbers by 100, instead of having decimals altogether. That is definitely one way to do it. So then your tax rate, instead of it being 0.12, it would actually be just 12. And then your price, instead of being $29.99, it would actually be $2,999, and that would actually be the integer that you use, and that would actually give you a little bit more accurate values. And then at the end, when you actually calculate the total, that's when you would actually just move over the decimal place there. And actually using this format is actually really good for a credit card processing company called Stripe. The reason I'm not doing is that it's just not super intuitive for the rest of us. So let's actually stick with what I'm doing here. even if the rounding is slightly off. And when I say slightly off, what you might actually get every once in a while for a total is, instead of it being, let's say, $1.29, it ends up being $1.29.00003. So something like that does occur every once in a while, whether it's a decimal field or a float number, which is what I'm going to do. Okay, so what this is going to give us is a new total, obviously, or a tax total itself. But what we want to do is actually make sure that we definitely don't have numbers like this. So I'm going to replace the tax total by turning it into, well, we're going to use some string substitution here. This string substitution will only give me 2 decimal places. And of course, this is now a string, so I want to turn it back into being a float number, a floating point number. And this, of course, is not perfect. I realize some of you that are a little bit more advanced in Python, you're going to be like, well, hey, there's all sorts of things on how you could probably solve this and do this better. But this to me is like by far the easiest way to solve that. But anyway, so now we've got a tax total. So this is what's going to actually replace that field itself. The next one is just going to be all of my total itself. So total is going to be the price plus the tax total. And yet again, with those floating point numbers, we don't actually know how that might end up. So I'm going to go ahead and just give another total value here and using that floating point number as well. Okay. And hopefully you're really familiar with Python. But when you do something like this, where you're resetting a variable, this side will always go off of the most previous variable first, and then the set variable will be the final one. Okay, so my totals then are going to be equal to the subtotal, and that's our subtotal here. And then our tax, this time I'm actually going to call it tax instead of tax total. The reason I'm calling it tax and subtotal is because that's what I named here, right? Okay, and then finally my total being my total. Okay, so now what I can do is say, well, I can actually add all of my items in here and associate it to my current instance, which is simply just self. So that means that I can actually come in here and say for key value pairs in totals.items, I can set attribute self key value. So what this is doing is saying, hey, the subtotal key, right? I'm actually going to set that on the instance to the subtotal value. It's the same thing as saying instance.subtotal equals to, whatever the total's subtotal value is. All right, so that's actually what we're doing here with the set attribute, but it's for every single one of these. Okay, and then I'll say if save equals to true, then I'll go ahead and just call self.save. And again, it's instance.save, or, we've been calling instance obj.save, same. Okay. And then we'll go ahead and return the totals themselves. Now, why is it that I did this? Well, this actually has to do with my signals and how signals end up working. Okay, so what we want to do here is I'm now going to import those signals. So from django.db.models.signals, we're going to import our pre-save and post-save signals. Okay, so the pre-save signal, well, I actually need a way to handle this. We'll call this order pre-save. And what comes in by default with a signal is sender, instance, and then args and keyword args. Okay. So what this means is that I can actually call something on this instance, which is the object or whatever is about to be saved in the database. So I can actually call instance dot calculate and save equals to false. And so since I'm doing this calculation, it's actually going to run through this entire instance method, but it is not going to actually save it to the database. And instead, what we're going to do is the pre-save method will save it for us, because what's happening here is at the end of the pre-save method, which we won't see, it's actually going to call instance.save. So this is going to set all of the key value pairs or all the fields themselves, and then after it's done, it's going to save it on its own. Now to actually use this, we're going to go ahead and say presave.connect, and we're going to connect to the receiver method, which is what this function is. That's a receiver function. And we're going to go ahead and say sender equals to the order itself. Okay. So this is probably a bit confusing. So you might be like, oh, well, what if I actually didn't use the pre-save method? What if I used the, after it was actually created and ran that way? Well, you could totally do that. So I'm actually going to copy this and use the post-save method now. So this is after it's already saved in the database and it's completely in the database for sure. Now we've got this order post-save. There's another argument that comes in here is whether or not it was created. So now what we can actually do is say if it's created, then we can run instance.calculate and say save equals to true. Inside of instance.calculate, it calls save if we say to save it, which means that once it calls save, it's going to call the pre-save signal. It's also going to call the post-save signal. So naturally, saving in either one of these signals, actually calling save in one of these signals, will actually recall itself. So you'll actually get a constant loop that's running and running and running. So you want to be very careful about doing that, which is why I wanted to show you these two different methods of essentially running the exact same thing. Up here, we just never need to call this because pre-save it's right before it's actually going to be saved. So we're kind of interrupting the save process to do some of our own stuff. And then down here is right after it is saved, and it's actually going to be called saved again. So this post-save signal will absolutely be called again. Now, I actually use this fairly sparingly for things like calculate, right? Pre-save actually makes a lot of sense to do the calculation in there because we're not then going to save it again, right? Like in this case, I just saved it to my database, and then I'm going to run save again, so I need to save it twice. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Instead, we're only saving it one time here. That's why I'm calling save being false. This is definitely going to be saving it twice because of the signal itself. And created, the nice thing about created is when you actually do create any object in there, it will actually update that post save. Cool. So that's signals. Definitely something that is like, whoa, that is almost out of left field and maybe a little challenging to wrap your head around. So it definitely takes some time to play around with. So let's actually see this in action. Hopefully everything works. I didn't actually test it yet, so let's go ahead and try it out. So right now I get this product is out of inventory. And if I refresh in here, I'm actually not saving anything because I have a validation error. So let's actually solve that validation error first. Going back into our product, into models.py. Now let's actually turn this inventory back into our original condition here, which is guessing whether or not it has inventory. And let's just verify that there is inventory in that product. And yes, there's a lot of inventory in there. So we've got this order now. And in here, here's that order. Now let's go back to our checkout process, and I'll just leave it in as ABC. And we get this error, unsupported type, decimal, and float. Yeah, no surprise there. So I actually have an error in my calculation itself. That's always fun. Okay, so what it's saying here is it cannot add a float number and a decimal number, right? Or it's actually having a hard time calculating these things. So what we can do instead of floats then, to be on the more safe side, is we can do from decimal, import the decimal class, and just change our float numbers that we were using to decimal numbers. And hopefully that actually solves the problem for us. I think that it might. So we refresh in here, we run that, and whoops, let's try that again. Hit send data. So it's still giving me this multiplication. I can't do it between a decimal and a float, which is because maybe all of the numbers are not actually decimals. So let's go ahead and call this a decimal number as well. And here is the fun part of doing math in pure Python without any additional libraries in here. Okay, so I got price is not defined. Okay, cool. No big deal there. So that means this price right here, just a little mistake there. That should have been subtotal. Okay, so let's keep going and refresh in here. And now all of those errors are gone. Okay, so again, I need to emphasize, I can't emphasize enough that using decimals and floats and all this stuff is a huge headache in Python. It's a huge headache in a lot of programming in general because of what float numbers are and what decimal numbers are. But you know, we can use the decimal class that's built into Python to solve that for our decimal field itself. Or to make things simple, which I purposefully did not make things simple, but to make them simple, you can just use those bigger numbers and then calculate the total, like a display total, instead of actually having the actual financial total itself. But anyways, let's check to see if the calculation happened. I refresh in here and hey, what do you know? It did actually happen. So that is pretty awesome. So what does that mean then? I can actually come back into my context for that view. I'm going to go ahead and now change this from forms.html to being checkout, or let's say orders/checkout.html, because we're definitely going to be changing how that actually works. And in this case, I'm going to go into my templates. I'm going to make a new folder in here called orders. And inside of this, I'm going to go ahead and call checkout.html. And let's go ahead and add in all of the same data from our form, except now what I want to actually have is also my object itself. So I want to do object dot maybe my totals in here. So let's go ahead and do subtotal, and let's actually put this into at least a paragraph tag just to make things nice and simple for us. Simple is the name of the game here. But not simple, but not too simple, right? It's simpler, maybe. Let's call it that. Okay, so subtotal and tax, and again, tax and final total and total. And let's go ahead and complete order. Or so we think. It's not quite there, but we will get there. All right, so let's go ahead and refresh in here. I actually don't have those numbers coming through, no surprise, because in my view, I did not actually add them in as context. I did not add the object itself as context. So let's go ahead and add in that object in our context variable itself. Oops, that should be order obj here, not object, but order obj. Okay, so we save that, and let's go back in. We refresh, and hey, there is our totals. With the tax in a proper format. And of course, if we do some mental math here, we do see that these numbers are correct, right? So there's not a rounding error in this case, but of course there certainly can be a rounding error where it's kind of not intuitive as to why we're getting that number per se. But the way I actually calculated this shouldn't cause a rounding number, because I actually rounded these two numbers, then added them and rounded again. So hopefully we won't actually see any calculation errors displayed to our user based off of the method I did. But you know, there always can be a problem from time to time. Okay, so we're still not quite done yet, right? There still is several other things that I do want to accomplish with this. Now, first and foremost, if the order is complete, well, now I can go ahead and say order obj dot paid equals to, well, whatever the order total is. I'm just going to assume that it actually is paid. So order object.total would actually be what that value is, right? So we actually don't have a credit card in here, obviously, but we can say that it is paid. So instead of actually doing that, what I can do is make another method called mark paid, or rather not mark paid, and save being false. Again, we are going to be saving here. So since I'm doing this instance method, it's not a whole lot different than what we've already seen, right? So we saw the calculate here. Now I can just do mark paid, so define mark paid. And the reason for this has to do with, well, what we've got up here. We've got our status as well as the paid amount. Now I actually come in here and say paid or custom amount. Let's say custom amount in here is equal to none, or we could use a default value in there. But the custom amount would be if I wanted to change it from the default value, right? So let's say, for instance, my total is equal to self.total, right? So self.total, of course, is reference to that field. And then we'll say if custom amount is not equal to none, then our total is equal to whatever that custom amount is. And again, I'm not doing any validation checks at this point, probably should, but that would be a way to be able to change what our paid amount is actually. So then I would say self.paid equals to whatever that paid amount is, which let's actually change this from total to paid amount. It's a silly naming convention there. But now we've got self.paid is whatever that paid amount is. And then we'll say if save equals to true, then it's just self.save, right? And then we'll go ahead and return self.paid. Now, one of the things that I also did not do is change or update the order status itself. So the order status, I also want to change to being paid. So that's this status right here. So then we'll just go ahead and say self.status equals to paid. Easy, simple. And the reason I'm putting part of the logic in here, well, there's several reasons. One of them being I might want to reuse this method somewhere else, right? I just like the calculate method, I might want to use it somewhere else. And then in the view itself, I could just call that method. The other thing is I could probably add, there is definitely another way to look at this is say changing the status here. So order obj.status equals to paid. I could totally change that status there and then add a signal, maybe a post save signal that's looking for that change in status that then actually runs the mark paid method itself. So it's certainly another option there, but in this case, I actually prefer this mark paid method because then I can call this mark paid whenever I want to and whether or not I want to save it. Now yet again, the reason I don't have to call save is because I'm calling it right after. And when in doubt, call save on the instance itself, not in an instance method, right? So in other words, I don't want to say save is true here and get rid of this. Right, when in doubt, don't do that. Do it this way. Okay, cool. So now let's actually see if it's actually been paid. Okay, so let's go ahead and refresh we don't have to refresh in here, but we'll go to this checkout. We'll hit complete order. It doesn't show me anything on the checkout page, of course, but if we actually look at the order itself, we now have a status of paid. We have the amount that they paid, which of course is identical to the total amount. And I'm not going to change it at this point, but if you had discounts or something like that, that could be a place to actually do that. But realistically, you would probably want to calculate discounts much like we did with tax. And it would just be based off of some other table, and then it would be subtracted from the total. So the paid amount, unless you're doing installments, which again adds another layer of complexity, the paid amount will probably stick at whatever that total amount is. So yeah, of course now we're like, okay, well, I just paid for this. How do I actually verify that it was paid for? Well, there's a couple of ways to do this. First off, I'm just going to go ahead and return the redirect. And we're going to go to a success page here, right? So instead of actually showing the form and all that, it actually makes a lot of sense to just go to success. Thank you for your order. And then what I also want to do is delete the session object of the order ID itself after it's been saved. So we'll go ahead and delete that value, which means now when they go back to that order, it's going to be a fresh order itself. So let's go ahead and try that. Hopefully the whole thing works. I hit complete order. Yes, there we go. It takes me to the success page. And so now when I go to the checkout again, completely clean, and it's going to try and have me complete the order. Notice that the shipping address is not there again, right? So if I create a new shipping address and hit complete order, again, yet again, a success call. Okay, so one of the things that we did not talk about is like a save method. Like instead of completing the order, is there a way to say, oh, save their progress, right? So it's not actually doing this. There's certainly a way to do that. It's just, again, another layer of complexity that not all of us will necessarily need to do. So that's not something I'm going to cover at this point. But we did cover a lot of really interesting things, but we're not quite done yet. And this is definitely a little bit longer one. I think I told you that there's just a lot to cover. But what we have to do now is, well, there's a couple things. We have to change how the inventory is, and that's actually pretty easy to do. And then we also have to have a way to handle if these orders are stale, right? So the stale part, this right here. Now, the shipped and refund, this is more of a action that you would do in the admin itself, probably, right? You'd probably use the Django admin to change what that status is. So in the future, if the user wanted to see all of their orders, they'd be able to see what that status might be. But let's actually go along with the paid portion, right? So the user just paid, it was marked as paid. How do we actually update what the inventory might be? So inside of mark paid, we can do this, that, hey, we are just now paying this, whatever it ends up being. And so what I want to say is, now I'm going to go ahead and do product equals to instance.product and product.inventory minus equals to 1 and product.save. Okay, so I'm updating the product inventory here. There's a couple of things that we need to consider here. Number one, should I actually be calling it manually like this, or should I have an instance method? I hope that your intuition at this point knows what that should be. Even if it doesn't, we'll cover it. The next thing is, should I actually have some sort of signal in here that I already updated the inventory? I think by the pure question of me, or the reason I'm even asking that would hopefully allude you to to what the answer should probably be. So inventory updated models.boolean field and default being false, right? So if the inventory is not updated, we'll come down here now and say if self.inventory updated, or rather if it's not updated, then we'll go ahead and update the inventory. And hopefully you had the intuition to say instance.product, and we'll go ahead and say item, which is essentially change the inventory itself, and I'll also call save being true. Okay, so this of course will also have to say and instance.product, right? So we want both of those things. So if the inventory is not updated, then we'll do that. And again, I actually want to move this self call down here, because now what we'll be doing is saying self.inventory updated being true. Okay, so we don't actually re-update this inventory. Now, what I just showed you is actually a really, really simple way to also do things like, hey, did the order shipped? Should we send an email? So email sent type of thing, right? So you can absolutely do the exact same idea in there, where this will then, instead of changing the product inventory, would change or signal whether or not we actually sent out the initial email for that. That's not something I'm going to cover at this point, but it is pretty cool that that's where we would end up doing this. Okay, so the next part is actually changing this into its own instance method, like we mentioned here. So I'm going to go ahead and just get rid of that and copy this item sold here and come in to my product models themselves. And again, making a instance method here, and we need to pass in self, so we actually have access to the object or the instance itself. And so if the item is sold, we need to say that the inventory is going down. So current inventory equals to self.inventory, and current inventory minus equals to 1. This is the same thing as saying equals to current inventory minus 1. For those of you who don't know that about Python. And then we'll go ahead and say self.inventory equals to whatever that current inventory or the new inventory is, really. And then, of course, if save equals to true, self.save. Otherwise, we're just going to return self.inventory. Okay. Yet again, this is an instance method that we can use anywhere if we need to lower the inventory or remove items from inventory. So you could call this something different, right? You could call it remove items from inventory and give a count there. So that's actually probably a little bit better. So remove item or items from inventory, and then you would say the count, whatever that count is. In my case, that count is 1. So this is a really good instance method, because if you have multiple orders for the same object or for the same product, then this item sold is no longer just one single order, but instead it's remove items from inventory and the count being 1. So then you can actually change whatever that count is on the fly based off of the order itself. But again, we don't have multiple orders in there. This is just more trying to future-proof this for you when you're actually creating and updating your product inventories just like that. Okay, so let's actually try this out. Let's try it all essentially from scratch, right? So what I'm going to do here, oh yes, haha, no such column, inventory updated. Yeah, well, you know, I violated one of my big rules, and that is if you change your models.py, you want to do make migrations, and then you'll go ahead and do python manage.py migrate. Okay, so we'll go ahead and come back. We'll run the server here again, and there we go. Okay, so now I've got this change order here. Notice that the inventory update is not there, but what I want to do is let's go ahead and delete all of this, just essentially starting from scratch. Our product has 100 items in inventory, so let's go ahead and actually do another checkout. Now again, with the form validation, you can actually validate all the shipping address and billing address if the product itself needs it. But let's go ahead and complete that order. And again, instance is not defined. No surprise here, just a little silly mistake in our instance. Perhaps you noticed that, and that's this right here. I said instance instead of self. My bad. So let's go ahead and call it self here. Save that, and let's go back into checkout. Complete this order. We went to the success page. That's good. So now let's actually go into products itself. Click on this product. Inventory is 99 now. Orders, we've got paid, and we have inventory updated. Okay. So of course now if we go back to checkout, it's a brand new order. This is a brand new order for the exact same item. So, you know, if you're like, oh, well, I want to be able to support them ordering multiple things, a really quick and simple way to do that is just say, hey, just order the first one and then order the second one and keep going. Unfortunately, that's how our system works right now. Simple solve. Not everyone loves that answer, but you know, that's how you can accept multiple orders here without getting too much more complexity. Okay, so the very last thing I'm going to do is a management command for actually making things go stale. But I will say that in our view itself, we do have, or rather in our form itself, we have a product has inventory flag here that will run this validation error. So if it actually does run out of inventory, but the actual checkout itself should probably have some sort of condition in there that's checking that as well. So like this product here, maybe on this, we would say if not product.has inventory, we return the redirect, you know, to maybe like no inventory or something like that, where it's like a coming soon page or an email capture page. That is definitely something that you might want to do in this order view as well. I'm going to leave that out for now. Okay, so we save that. So now, switching gears yet again. Okay, so this is still all about the orders and making sure that we are doing our best with our orders and the inventory itself. So if a product order is going stale, now the way I actually create this order, if you recall back like an hour ago, is right here, right? I create it when they go to that view. I do not create it when the order is being trying to be completed. So that's incredibly important for this next part, which is I want to actually make a python manage.py command, and I'm going to call this orders update, something like that, right? Right now it's saying it doesn't know of this command. So I just want to create that command. And so I'm actually going to show you how to do it, but I'm going to copy and paste code just to speed things up a bit. So let's go ahead and come in to our orders model, or our orders module itself, create a new folder in here. This folder is called management. This has to be called management. This is how you do it inside of Django. And inside of there, we need to create an init file. And inside of that, we need to create another folder called commands. Yes, I know, it's folders on folders. And then you got another one for init. And then finally, the command name that we want to give it. In my case, it's orders update.py. So that will actually correspond, that name corresponds to this command right here. So what I'm going to do here is actually just paste some code that you may or may not be aware of on how it works. So we'll just talk about it real quick. First off, the actual time zone itself. So Django has time zone timestamps that are related to all of this stuff. So you can actually get what now is in the time zone that you're in, and it'll actually give you that value. And these two items, what that does is the start of the day at absolute midnight, which we see here with all these zeroed out numbers, minus 2 days ago, right? So what I'm trying to do is get in a 24-hour period from really like a day and a half ago, but depending on your time zone. But let's say it's 2 days ago. I want to get the start of that day and the end of that day. So this is actually how you go about filtering that. So it's going to be greater than. GTE stands for greater than or equal to today's start, and then today's start being this time zone right here, and then otherwise is less than or equal to today end, which is the end of that day. So this filter hopefully will be in between that day, and then it's more specifically having this status of created, right? So these are all of the created items that don't have paid on there, right? So they were never marked as paid. I'm actually marking all of them right here with stale. So query set.update actually goes about doing that. So what we say is we can also say for obj in QS and then obj.status equals to stale, and then obj.save. Now the reason you would do this method over this method has to do with the fact this method will actually still send our database signals. So post save and pre-save, that will absolutely still send those things. So if you wanted to send some sort of email reminder or something like that, hey, you didn't complete your checkout, come back and check out. So something along those lines is how you would go about doing that. So I'm going to leave that out. But QS.update updates all of the items in this query set with whatever value you're passing in there. So now that we've got this command, we can actually call python manage.py orders update. Oops, I forgot an import there. So we're going to import the date time. Okay, so let's go ahead and run that. And I forgot order. Simple, simple, simple. Okay, so from orders.models, we're going to import the order itself. Save that, and then finally, we now have that custom management command. Now, of course, at this point, because I don't have orders that are that old, this actually won't work, as in it won't actually change things to being stale, because, well, there's nothing like that. So we could obviously test that, but I'm going to leave that to you guys at this point. And do keep in mind that another way to think about this is you could just do less than or equal to, if it's less than or equal to that to today's end, and it has that same status, then you could just call that stale too. But I really just wanted to do it in a 24-hour period, and this is actually how you go about doing that, just like that. Cool, and of course that's timestamp field. The reason I can use the greater than or equal to a timestamp object or a datetime object is because of this timestamp field right there. Okay. Wow. We just did a ton, and it probably went way too fast for the vast majority of you. So thank you for bearing with me on that. I am now going to be jumping into questions for a few minutes. Totally understand if this went a lot longer. Part of that was I was overly ambitious in what I wanted to cover today. The other part was that little interruption. So sorry about that. So let me know if you have any questions. I'm going to be jumping in to those questions here in just a moment. I just need to load up my Q&A thing that's going on here. And yeah, I think this was a huge conceptual leap for a lot of you if you are struggling already with Django, right? So like this is definitely something where if you weren't able to keep up, totally get it. Like as far as actually coding with me, I don't know if the vast majority of you would be able to actually code with me at the same rate. But I will say that if most of this if you understand most of this, then you are definitely ready to get into a lot more advanced Django topics. So my challenge to you would be, hey, how do you actually test all this? As in the unit tests that I did yesterday. I'm actually not going to be spending any more time on unit tests, but this is something that I do recommend that you try and give this a shot. So now I'll go ahead and take your questions related to today's stuff. So if you have questions, let me know. I have, I am queuing them up right now. Okay. So here, first question is a good one. Let's see here. Can I explain signals? Yes. So whenever you call create, like model name.objects.create, that will send a signal. Whenever you create or call on an object or an instance from a model, whenever you call save on that, that will also call a signal. You can also, whenever you call delete, that will also call a signal. Now, what these signals are is literally like when these actions occur, what do we need to do with those actions, right? So the signals then send out signals. They send out like, hey, this was just saved. This instance was just saved. So what do you want to do anything about it, if anything at all? So then you create receiver functions that can actually handle those signals actually happening. If you don't have signals, or if you don't actually have receivers for those signals, then the signals are still being sent. They're just not being consumed by anything. So you actually don't have to really worry about the way they work. But there are a number of different kinds of signals. And I think actually what I covered earlier hopefully actually clarifies how to actually execute them. But really, it's just a simple method that happens whenever you save something. So it's either right before it's saved or right after it's saved. Both of those actually work, but there's also one for right before it's deleted or right after it's deleted. Both of those things work. So yeah, thanks for the question. That's a good one. So can we use post save signal to update another model if the save method on the current model is run? Yes, you can absolutely use post save to update other models as well. Now, I would say that the design of this can get a little tricky. So if you're constantly using signals to save to other models, as in not the model that's sending the signal itself, you might actually run into a lot of redundancy and redundant signals themselves. So I like to make them as simple as they possibly can be when in doubt, right? So just make it as simple as it possibly can be, and then prior to even using signals, if it's too confusing for you, just do all of it in a view, literally all of it, including all the instance methods that I created. Do all of it in that view, and then start to think like, hey, what of this might I reuse somewhere else, right? So that calculate method was a really good example of that. That could actually be used on any signal. That could also be used on any view. That could also be used in an AJAX call, like if you need to recalculate things, that would be another way to do it. An AJAX call being asynchronous JavaScript object notation, or asynchronous JavaScript request rather. That would actually call a REST API and also do that same calculation if you had other sorts of things in there. So for that specific example, it made a lot of sense to put it in as an instance method, but not every method needs that. So you can still do some more of that logic inside of the view itself. So yeah, just try things out a lot in this on your own as much as you can, and really challenge like, what other kind of logical pieces could I put here? And like the email one is an obvious example. How can I email the calculated totals every single time? Like literally, hey, well, why don't you try that out and see if you can actually execute that in a signal, without a signal, in a view, all that sort of stuff. There is something else that's also really cool, is instead of using signals inside of the request itself, there's something called celery. That means that you can actually send it to another working process, which could be on another server, and actually calculating things for you. So like if you start hitting scale and you're having like millions of people ordering things, then you're probably not going to do it in this method. Instead, you would probably push it to another working process that will quickly calculate things for you. But that instance method still could be used. It would just not be done on the request like we did it, right? So like when I actually went to the view itself and it actually did the calculation, that's not always going to happen in the view, is what I'm kind of getting at there. Okay, cool. Thanks for the question. That was a good one. Thank you for enjoying the boot camp, I guess. Thank you for the comment. That's what I should say. I'm glad you're learning a lot. And I realized today was like, we just really did a lot, and probably too much for an hour. I had a sense that would be the case when I was preparing this one. But I didn't want to spend too much time on these things while also still getting you as much of a much densely packed content as possible. Next one. So management commands are great to work with cron tab. Absolutely. So if you're not familiar with cron tab, it's just a way to schedule execution to happen. So on your server, you can set up a scheduler that literally calls that Python method, which is exactly what you would end up doing it with. I mean, you could always do it manually, but you would probably want it to be scheduled of some kind. Cron tab's a way to do that. Celery, which I just mentioned, is another way to do that. And I do have a course coming out soon called Time and Task 2 on my website that will absolutely cover Celery in a modern fashion. I do have a Time and Task 1, so if you really want to learn it right now, Time and Task 1 still covers it, and it's still definitely relevant today. But a new one's coming out to show you how to do all of those fun things. And hopefully more bite-sized pieces, not so much content in one thing. Yeah. Okay. So how do you know what function in a model can overwrite? I'm not quite sure what you mean by that, David. Can you rephrase that and ask again? I'll definitely try and get that for you soon. Folders and folders. Yeah, it was folders and folders. You're right. Okay. Let's see here. So can we add a field for the count of the product because the user might need to buy 2 or 3 or 4 from the same one? Yes, you absolutely can have a field that has count in there. You can have it as a choice, like a char field choice, right? Like I did before, where you essentially are using a character field for the various choice options for any given product. Here, let me actually just show you that, what I mean. So right here, we have, 5 possible options for the status itself, right? You can do that same thing for the product count. Like you could have a count item very similar to status with strings of the count. And then when you go to calculate things, you would convert those strings into integers, actual integers, that would actually show you how to do the calculation. That's a quick and probably not super clean way, but a quick way that you could go about doing that, and also limiting the amount that they could put in, and also not requiring them to type 1, 2, 3, or 4, and so on. Of course, you could also use an integer field and allow them to select the number that they want, and then having in your form, having some validation based off of whatever that number is for that particular product, having validation in there to make sure that it doesn't exceed maybe the amount of inventory that's in that product, and or exceed some arbitrary number that you set. Yeah, so that's a good question, and that's where we start getting to a little bit more advanced e-commerce, right? So I do have a full-on e-commerce course that covers how to do a lot more of the advanced things here, but I really wanted to just emphasize hopefully how easy it is. It might feel like it's not easy, but hopefully how easy it is to actually charge something, of course without the credit card, but to actually charge something and also monitoring the inventory at the same time. So taking into account both of those things, but actually adding additional products, you could totally do that. And then you could also have fields in your product model itself that says whether or not they can order multiple things. So that would actually be in the product itself. So yeah, thanks for the question. Appreciate it. Is there any Node Bootcamp coming up? Not yet. I mean, maybe at some point I'll have to do a Node Bootcamp. I'm not positive if the bootcamps themselves, like doing this live, I'm not positive if it's the best method to teach you guys. Part of the reason being that, yeah, it's cool to see me do it live, maybe you guys really enjoyed that part of things. But part of the reason is if I ever have production issues like I did today, the garbage collector came right at the beginning, so if there's ever production issues like that, then I can just edit those things out. And I think that serves you a lot better when you're trying to learn some of this stuff. But I do think that there's a lot of value in the Q&A part, right? So doing the live Q&A maybe after one of these things is released, that actually might be something that I end up doing more of, instead of kind of like a hybrid where it's like pre-recorded and then literally like 30 minutes after I release it on YouTube or on my website, I do a live session to talk about that. So it's almost like exactly like the same live stream. I might end up doing it that way. If I get a lot of people really liking these live streams, then maybe I'll end up doing that. But again, the production issues are like, unless I move into a really rural area where the garbage truck doesn't come next to where my studio is, I might not be able to always control actually how that happens. Obviously, you could be like, well, just don't do it on the days that those things come. Well, that's not any fun. So yeah, I don't know. I don't know if I'll continue doing boot camps. The other thing is like, the interaction is great when we start doing the Q&A. So I think the value is actually much more about the live Q&A than it is about the boot camp. But if you guys feel differently, let me know. I would love to hear what your thoughts are there. So thanks for that. Let's see, next one. Will I cover continuous integration and continuous deployment, or CI/CD, with Django? At some point, yes. It will not be covered in this bootcamp because it's really important. And for those of you who aren't familiar with what it is, it's essentially automating the testing process when you actually push it into deployment, or automating parts of it so you can constantly deploy, and it will also build your application and do all the things that need to happen when you go into production. So it's definitely a topic that I do need to cover, and at some point I will have to get there. And it's not only for Django, it would be for all sorts of Python and JavaScript applications, if other things as well. Thanks for the question. Okay, is it better to create a company model and link to all models, orders, and inventory, and link this company to the user, or link the company directly to the orders inventory? So I think what you mean, if you had different companies selling different things, what I would do there is actually assign or associate the company to the product itself. And that's it. You don't actually need to associate it any further than that, because the order has a foreign key association to the product, which means the order itself has access to everything that's related to that product, which would include the company itself, much like the user, right? So that's another example of that. So thanks for that question. Something that I think I just realized is our order. Oh yeah, okay, good. I was gonna say our order, is it even associated to the user? And it is. It just kind of slipped my mind for a moment. Anyways, okay, cool. Thank you for that. Okay, so here's a good question. How do you use the currency data type instead of decimal field? Yeah, so there is a third-party package that allows you to use a currency field instead. I actually hardly ever opt to that. Instead, I turn, like I was saying earlier, I turn the decimal numbers into a whole number, so the decimal places don't make as much of a problem for me. So the currency data type, I would say the third-party documentation probably has a lot on this. But if you're losing fractions of a cent, or even fractions of like if you're losing 1,000th of a cent, that's probably something that happens fairly commonly anyway. So you either round up or round down on that, and I think at the end of the day, you'll probably end out ahead. Maybe that's not the best answer to being perfectly accurate, but I think the rounding actually has to happen in this case. I'm actually curious to see what an accountant would say about that in this case, like a proper certified public accountant, because I personally think that those minor rounds should actually go one way or the other. And if you round them up all the time, then you will have to account for that in your accounting somewhere, because eventually it might end up being $1, So it's really not that much that actually would make that much of a difference. So, yeah, thanks for the question. Okay, let's see here. Thank you for the nice compliment. I appreciate it. Yeah, I enjoy doing this. I don't know if you can tell. When's the next live Q&A? I might do it later today, so maybe 9 hours from now. But I'm also not positive if I will, because I have to prep for tomorrow. Last week's stuff, I didn't need that much preparation for because I know it so well. But like what I did today, I definitely need to test all these things out. I do know it really well, but just doing literally all of this off the top of my head is probably not going to happen, right? So, yeah. I don't know if I'll end up doing one later today. Thanks for that question. I missed self.instance, probably. If you find any code errors, please just submit a pull request on the GitHub repo, which is, instead of cfe.sh/YouTube, just go to GitHub, and then you'll be able to find it there. Thank you for that comment. Okay. So, David, I think this is what you're referring to from earlier. You define a model that inherits from some models, let's say model.form. How do you know what functions you have in that parent model so you can override it? Good question. Okay, so a quick and easy way to find out what's associated to any class, which is actually what you're asking. So every class, every Python class has a bunch of methods that are built into it. And then if you inherit from that class, meaning you pass the class in as the primary object, much like models.model, for example, you can actually print out dir on an object of that class. That's actually a really quick and easy way to find what's associated to that. So an init method, for example, that's very basic Python stuff. That's associated to, I think every single class definitely has an init method, even if there's not a whole lot going on in that class. So that's like a built-in standard that Python has for all of their classes. So if you're referring to things that Django has, just literally dir around one of those objects, you'll be able to find out all of the different things that are in there. And sure, they don't necessarily give you all the answers about it, but that will allow you to then do further research on your own. Okay, guys, so I'm only going to do a few more minutes on this because this was supposed to be about an hour, and it's turned into being about an hour and a half, maybe a little longer. Okay, so is there any major difference between manually programming the signal and using the receiver decorator? No, they work exactly the same. The receiver decorator is something that some people like to use on signals, and more specifically around the actual receiver function, which is totally something you can do. I just really like calling the actual signal itself, especially if I need to do it multiple times. So yeah, I'm not sure if that answers your question. For whatever reason, I just never really got into the receiver decorator, but some people really like it. I think it's an extra import that you just don't need, I guess. Cool. Thanks for the question. Okay. Can I do a live Q&A around this time for Europeans someday? Absolutely. Once the bootcamp's done, I'll try and do more live Q&As around this time. This is a really good time, I think, for a lot of us for those live Q&As. For me, doing them at 9 p.m. or 8 p.m. After a long day is sometimes pretty challenging, and I want to actually be very, very like energetic while I do these live Q&As. You know what I mean? So yeah, thanks for the question. Okay, so I got a few other questions here that I'll just try and answer real fast. If we add a user to the fields with a button and some data, how do we save this model? I'm not sure what you're asking, Valado. Sorry about that. You're in Nepal. You can't actually do international payment services, aka no credit cards. Is there a way to host your static files and images where they don't ask for a credit card, as in for free? I don't know. Maybe somebody else can answer that question as far as static files hosting. Something I haven't covered yet. This is a good question, a little bit out there. You do not need to include, or you should include your migrations with your Git repo, right? Because if you need to make changes to your production database and you're pushing that code, those migrations are going to be critical for that through Git. Thanks for the question. Okay. All right, guys. So looks like we've got a few more things. Will we have more complex boot camps after this one? Perhaps we'll see. I just talked about boot camps and where I may or may not go with them. But anyways, that's it, everyone. Thanks so much for coming out for day 7. I realized there was just a lot jam-packed in this, so feel free to let me know if you have any questions on the video itself later. So put those in the comments, and I hope to do some more live Q&As in the future. I really think what might be really good for a live Q&A is that you guys, somebody sends me some code that I review in the live Q&A to give some actual feedback to that user or that person and on their code themselves, and then everybody else can also benefit from that. If that's something you really want to see happen, also let me know in the comments of this video, not necessarily in the live chat that's going to end, but the actual comments once it actually goes on YouTube. That actually might be something really good, so then we can all learn from mistakes that might be made with other users' things, or just solving a challenge that they're having. Not necessarily mistakes, just, hey, how do you do this? I don't know how to do it. That might be something that I end up doing at some point. So thanks so much for watching, guys. I really appreciate the support, and I will see you hopefully tomorrow.